So I'm Tom Atchley, and I've lived in Redlands my whole life, and I've gone to Sacred Heart, Mentone Elementary for kindergarten, and then Redlands Junior High, then Redlands High School, and then I went to Valley College for 2 years, and then I transferred to the University of Redlands about 1969. And then graduated in '73. In my senior year in college, I started reading the Redlands Citrograph, and then I started indexing it. And then after I indexed, I started reading the Redlands Daily Facts, and then the Laguna, Southern Californian, and I've indexed all the newspapers, early newspapers of Redlands. And if you read the newspapers, you end up knowing a lot about the history and about the people that lived here and fashioned that history. We were asked what we would like to do for our paper for this senior problems class, and I think the instructor said, "Well, you're a Redlands kid. Why don't you do a paper about Redlands early history?" And I thought, "Oh, geez, I know everything about Redlands early history." And I'll just read, and they said, "Why don't you read the first 6 months of the Redlands Citrograph?" That started in 1887, and then write up a paper and tell us what you've learned. I wrote the paper, and I got so hooked because I found out that I knew absolutely nothing about Redlands early history. And then after that, I just kept realizing the more I found out, the less I really knew, and so I just kept researching. The significance of the Zaha, if you're a highfalutin college and you're pronouncing it in the Spanish versus the Sankey, is that it's an irrigation ditch, and it's Crafton, Laguna, Redlands, Bryn Mawr, and Loma Linda all grew up on the banks of the Zaha. You have to have irrigation water here in Southern California to survive. So along its banks, after construction in 1819, first of all, a native Indian village got started and started growing corn and squash and oats and barley and learning agricultural pursuits. And as time went on, other communities, Old San Bernardino sprang up in the 1850s, Crafton in the 1860s, Laguna in the late 1860s, and Redlands in the 1880s all sprang up along the banks of the Sankey. And it's easier for me to say Sankey because I'm old Redlands. I never heard it pronounced correctly until about 25 years ago. And so when I'm with Redlanders, I say Sankey. When I'm with people that I'm introducing to the area, I say Zaha, because the J is pronounced as an H in Spanish. The often told story is that the Native Americans, with Chief Solano digging the Zaha, used the shoulder blades of cattle and other such nonsense. And the truth is that Gabriano Indians, along with native Kuhia and Serrano that lived here, were able to get from Mission San Gabriel shovels from the foundry they had there in a blacksmith shop. And so digging in the Zaha was with real tools. And in fact, they used a couple of oxen on the areas where it's really hard pan. In Redlands, they tied up the 2 oxen to a big plow they called a crowder, and the crowder went through like a ripper, and it broke up the clay on the surface, and then all they had to do is clear the area for the water to come down. But most places, like here in Sylvan Park, this is a natural gully. There was no digging required here. All they had to do is get the water out of Mill Creek, cross under what is now Highway 38, and follow a natural overflow of Mill Creek. And the actual digging didn't start till like Texas Street in West Redlands, and then contouring it over to Brookside Avenue, and then finally down through Loma Linda. Some digging there, but otherwise this is just a natural overflow for flood years of Mill Creek. That's how these big cobblestones get in here. These are cobblestones really from good old Mentone. Citrus industry came much later. The first thing that started was barley, oats, wheat, and just cereal types of foods, squash and other things grown for the Native Americans, and then alfalfa in the early 1860s, and then not till 1857, Anson van Leuven plants 2 or 3 or 4 orange trees next to his house down on Mountain View in the Zaha, and they did very well. And by 1865, he is selling each orange at 50 cents a piece because they're oddities. They taste good and they ripen in February, and so you could have fresh fruit in February. They did so well that others, Myron Crafts planted an orange grove in 1860. The Crams over in Highland planted an orange grove in 1870. And even when Laguna got started, the north part of Redlands, they planted a few orange trees, but most of the things that were planted were vineyards for raisins and peaches, apricots, plums. Laguna was advertised in the 1870s as the place where the apricot grows without any type of competition. Apricot production was great. And then you not only got the apricot, which you could put in a fruit dryer and dry and sell, but you also got the pit. And you can put the pit inside your stove at your house and cook with it. And it's like a charcoal. It's like perfect for cooking and baking. The common held belief is that Laguna and Redlands have been separated from the very beginning and they became one town and incorporation. My research shows that they were synonymous. Laguna starting earlier on another ditch called the Barry Roberts Ditch, which then was rerouted and became the Sunnyside Ditch. But the Sunnyside Ditch water was brought over to Redlands, 50 shares of it, and Judson and Brown began their first 500 acres with water that was really part of Laguna area. The school that started in Laguna starts in 1877. Laguna, named for the Lugo family land grant for the area. And the Redlands School District starts in 1884 with one school. However, Judson and Brown were from Laguna. They were there in 1877. They're the first real estate people who are selling land like crazy there and here in Redlands. And so as I've researched Laguna, I found out that the two towns start synonymously. The first real estate subdivision maps for Laguna came out in 1887. The first subdivision maps for Redlands came out in 1882. So which is older? Okay. And then of course, Laguna got its first business building in 1886. Redlands got its first Union Bank building in 1887. State Street started having businesses go up quite a bit in 1887. So did Colton and Orange Street get business buildings at the same time. Laguna had a newspaper 1 month before Redlands called the Southern Californian, and Redlands got the Citrograph 2 weeks later. But Laguna Chronicle was out in 1884. Laguna had a post office in 1884. Laguna had a grocery store in 1884. Everybody that lived in the settlement of Redlands in 1881 had to go to Laguna to get their mail and to get groceries because Redlands didn't have that. Redlands, though, built its first hotel, Prospect House, in 1882. Laguna got its first hotel in 1886, Laguna Terrace Villa Hotel. Prospect House was in Prospect Park, and the terrace hotel for Laguna was on the terrace. So the two communities had they were never two communities. Judson and Brown never imagined it as two communities. In fact, the first citations of Redlands, it's called Laguna. And when Judson and Brown advertised the Redlands tract, it was from Laguna, California. Okay, so as I said, I see the two areas as synonymous. I think what's happened is over the years, beginning with the freeway, we begin to think of North Redlands as a different entity than South Redlands. And in fact, from history standpoint, they were always the same. The Frank Morrison, who started the first bank in Redlands, came to Laguna first. Judson and Brown's real estate office was in Laguna. And so, as I said, the post office, the grocery store, first school, first academy was the Bellevue Academy, and that was up on the terrace, 1885, and that's in Laguna. Redlands High School doesn't start until 1891, and it starts in Laguna on the corner of Orange and Colton Avenue. So, but by that time, by 1891, it's called Redlands High School. We've incorporated, and so the whole area is called Redlands. The research I've done shows that the Smileys were, at least one of the Smiley twins was here in 1886, and he attended a prohibitionist meeting in Laguna, and he was infatuated with that as a Quaker, that this area was concerned about its future, and they didn't want to attract saloons, and they didn't want to attract all the problems that go with inebriation. And so I think it was Alfred who was here first, went back and told his brother, and then a couple years later they bought land up in what became Smiley Heights or Canyon Crest Park. But their arrival here is in Laguna, at least in 1886, 2 years before the town incorporates. Dr. JDB Stillman. He is the personal physician of Leland Stanford. And in the 1850s, he's in the gold fields in Northern California, and he meets two of the big four of the building of the Central Pacific Railroad. And he strikes up quite a friendship between two of the four members of what later on are going to start the railroad. He also starts in 1855 a hospital in San Francisco, and then gets interested in writing. He writes for Overland Monthly. He writes for a number of journals, which were at that time the Life magazine of their period, and or you might say the television of its time period. He talks about life out west. In his history of mining, he writes a book, and the result of this book becomes a bestseller. And decides that he wants to get out of Northern California and retire to Southern California because he's heard great things about the area. So in 1878, he comes down to Southern California and he buys land in Laguna. He plants 3 80-acre vineyards here at where the University of Redlands now stands, puts in a winery, builds a house up on Administration Hill in 1882, and he's like a rock star. When he comes to Laguna, there's been no famous people living in Laguna up until his arrival. And he is a known entity, nationally known for his writings, as I said, in Overland Monthly. In 1882, Stanford says, why don't you put together this collection of materials I have on horses running. And Stillman writes a book called The Horse in Motion, which is essentially a book about the physiology of how a horse running at full speed will all 4 hooves come off the ground at the same time. And of course, guess what? They lined up 13, 14 different cameras with Edward Muybridge, a nationally known photographer. They did this at his ranch in where Stanford University is today on the Quad. they had the horse run around, and they took the photos and put it all together. And from all that, Stillman, interested in physiology as a doctor, wanted to study the muscles, asked Leland Stanford if he could slaughter the horse, cut it all apart, and did, studied the muscles. And then because he had been working for Overland Monthly and he'd already written a book about his gold mining experiences, said, I will take all the material, I will go to London, and I will get it published, because that's where you publish scientific materials at the time. He did that. And so when he comes to Laguna once again to retire in 1882, his son is running the ranch. He is famous from all the things he's done. So his key is, his most important thing he does for Redlands is, when in 1887, Judson and Brown and others, Frank Morrison and others get interested in incorporating the city, they look to the old master. They look to JDB Stillman as the guy to bring them together and to chair the Unification Committee on Incorporation for Redlands. And of course, he dies before our incorporation takes place, but one of the things that he emphasized is that don't get caught up on the name Redlands or Laguna or Fredelba or any other name that you might come up with, Redonia, Citropolis, or any of the other names that were thrown out. He said, don't get excited about that. We're all one here. And so here is a man who'd settled in Laguna and started this great vineyard, saying we need to incorporate for our own sakes to create a community that will ban, for instance, saloons, and will have libraries, wide avenues, parks, and things that New England town would have. And he was kind of that first spirit. Before the Smileys became important, which was after incorporation, it was JDB Stillman who's really the leader of getting things started in terms of uniting the communities. But as I said earlier, they weren't that disunited. There was a war for a while between the Citrograph editor, Scipio Craig, and the editor of the Laguna, Southern California, both doing what a local paper should do, ballyhooing their particular area and getting citizens to support incorporation. But as it turned out, a little bit of bad blood occurred in the editorial columns between the Citrograph and the Laguna, Southern California, enough that Stillman made sure that the first Laguna, Southern California editor got fired. A new one was replaced, came in to make sure that the two communities blended together copacetically. So I would say, besides Judson and Brown, I'd have to say Frank Morrison. Frank Morrison came from San Francisco. In 1882, bought land in East Redlands, Morrison Drive, East Palm Avenue, in that area, and he brought with him some San Francisco money, and he invested that money in the Big Bear enterprise. Without his financial backing, the Big Bear Dam doesn't get built, and Redlands never solves its water problem. And Morrison does something that's not unique. He marries Stillman's daughter. And so when Stillman dies, his money stays in Redlands in the Morrison Bank. And so that money, the combined Morrison money and the Stillman money are together. And that financial aspect is very important, because otherwise Judson and Brown have to go to Louis Jacobs in San Bernardino to get loans, and the interest rate was 10% compounded monthly. So if you're borrowing $30,000 to build the Big Bear Dam, oh my gosh, you better come up with a lot of money very quickly to pay it off, or the interest on the borrowed capital will eat you alive. And so Morrison provided that for the Bank of the East San Bernardino Valley, coming through with loans to Judson and Brown that made it possible for the community really to get started. And if you're a farmer, you're borrowing money to buy your land, to buy your orange trees, and the water shares that are necessary. All that becomes part of it. But as far as the early pantheon of individuals, there's quite a list. I mean, David Morey should be on that list, and then his wife Sarah. We always think of David, but Sarah planted the first, had the first nursery in Redlands on Brookside Avenue. And so when E.J. Waite plants the first grove in what is Redlands in 1881, the trees came from Sarah Morey's nursery down on Brookside Avenue. And so while he gets credit for planting the first trees, really Sarah Morey planted the first trees, and then basically made sure that those trees, when they were finally planted, were navel orange trees. That is, they were budded over to navels so that they would produce an orange that did not have seeds. And that became economically the most viable thing for Redlands. Okay, so the orange industry starting really slow, because the first packing house, one of the first packing houses in Redlands, the Edwards Chamberlain House, which is at 21 Stewart Street, its first shipment out was celery, because it takes 5 years for orange trees to begin to, you got to plant them, and it takes 5 years for them to mature enough before you get a crop. And so those first crops that went out, remember that Anson van Leuven is selling oranges for 50 cents a piece in 1863, and enough word gets around slowly but surely that these navels are going to, they're going to be a marketable item nationally. With the completion of 2 railroads, the Santa Fe in 1888 and the Southern Pacific coming to Redlands in 1892, now you have a viable way to get oranges to market. So those first trees planted are about 90 orange trees to the acre. You could buy an acre in land in Redlands in 1881 for $50 an acre. Each of the trees cost $1 a piece. It takes 90 trees to the acre. For $900 you could plant your orange grove, plus $500 to buy the 10-acre orange grove land. And in 5 years, each of those trees is going to produce about 10 to 15 boxes, field boxes of oranges per tree. And in those first years, you were getting $5 to $6 per box of oranges. And so you could, if you do the math here very quickly, 90 trees to the acre, 15 boxes per tree, times $5 per box, and guess what? You can build the Morey house, because you've got 900 trees times $15 per tree, and that's a lot of money. So the result is that citrus became very popular. In fact, all of Southern California became a citrus orchard. Orange County, San Bernardino area, but Redlands, with its 26, 27 packing houses, included Laguna, Redlands, Bryn Mawr, Crafton, Green Spot, and Highlands, and even parts of Del Rosa were all part of our district. The result is we dominated. So by 1943, as an example, Redlands is shipping 6,000 carloads of oranges out of its district alone. Enough so that we placed a big sign on what is now Redlands Boulevard, was Highway 99, a big sign that says Navel Orange Capital of the World. And we weren't lying, because 6,000 carloads, about 360 boxes per empty train car, shipped out of California, shipped out of at least Redlands alone. That's one heck of a lot. 1913, disastrous freeze. For 5 years, Redlands doesn't produce a crop of oranges. Several of the packing houses went broke. Population of Redlands from 1910 to 1920 went down. It was worse than the Great Depression, because the trees were defoliated, temperatures 16 degrees for 2 or 3 hours. January of 1913, big disaster. The town not only lost the 5 years crops of oranges, but also the rich, the elites that have been wintering in Redlands for years, coming here as snowbirds, decided on Beverly Hills, Santa Barbara, and other locations to stay during the winter months because this area was so depressed after 1913. The Burridge family, a number of others decided that it would be better to go someplace else. Auchincloss family that lived up on Cajon Street. Several others decided that Redlands, as I said, didn't have the orange blossoms coming out in April because the trees were so whacked by that huge freeze. The orange industry had a lot of help. Okay, first of all, we always had we could always depend upon immigrants to work in the orange orchards. First, it was the Native Americans, then it was Chinese. And then we went through Japanese, Filipinos, Mexicans, all different kinds of immigrant groups coming to California worked for pennies on the dollar in terms of providing the labor for orange groves, which is very labor intensive. But the biggest national aid to Redlands in terms of the orange industry was President McKinley. Before he was president, he was Senator McKinley. And Senator McKinley was a good Republican in favor of a national tariff that would protect industrial goods of the United States. Andrew Carnegie's steel from German steel, manufacturing of all kinds of major products, and a few very select farm items like grapes, wine, and oranges. And they signed into law in 1896 a tariff called the McKinley Tariff that basically didn't allow Italy, Mexico, and other countries that produce citrus to sell that product here in California or the United States, giving the citrus farmers of California a monopoly on the market. And that occurs in 1896, and that kept going all the way up until after World War II. The result was McKinley Tariff. No wonder we invited him to come to Redlands. So on his May trip to Redlands in 1901, he was heralded as a hero, because he indeed was a hero. Redlands was a Republican town, and here's the leading Republican who has passed a national tariff that's going to provide a monopoly for your particular industry, in this case citrus, to continue unabated for who knows how long. And if you were charging $5 a box previously, now what could you charge if you didn't have to worry about, foreign competition as far as orange prices are concerned? We had 3 railroads to Redlands. Most people don't realize that, but 3 railroads. The first railroad was Santa Fe. And Santa Fe, Judson and Brown had to induce the railroad to build to Redlands. And to induce them to build here, Laguna was also part of that competition, because everybody thought, well, the railroad's going to go to Laguna because after all, Stillman, friend of Stanford, lives in Laguna. In fact, there's the inter-railroad track, which is in Laguna, including Sun Avenue, Brockton, and several others. And Laguna people were going to donate the land for a station. When Santa Fe decided to build a Redlands, it was because Redlanders bought all the right-of-way necessary. Judson and Brown donated the Santa Fe Depot site, okay, and basically put out the welcome mat. And so Santa Fe, or the Southern California Railroad, extended to Redlands, and they arrived in April of 1888. So the Santa Fe track still comes to Redlands today, and of course it comes via San Bernardino. We had another railroad after Santa Fe called the Dinky. It's the San Bernardino and Redlands Railway. 6 gentlemen, 3 of them living in Old San Bernardino and 3 living in San Bernardino itself, invested in building a narrow gauge track from Rialto Avenue and Rialto and East Street in San Bernardino, and came all the way through to Redlands through Drew, Gladesta, Old San Bernardino on Mission Road, and then West Citrus Avenue, the The right-of-way in West Citrus is still there. Right as you turn on California Street, you'll see it. And they followed Citrus in and then crossed the bridge down by Esri, and then finally made it into Redlands and paralleled the Santa Fe track. Their station was on the corner of Redlands Boulevard and Orange Street, okay? So that train, narrow gauge, usually pulled only 1 or 2 cars, made 6 round trips to Redlands, okay, each day. Take that back, 3 round trips. There were 2 engines, one starting off from Redlands, one starting from San Bernardino each day and crossing in between and going back and forth. They carried most of the transportation between Redlands and San Bernardino. It was called the Dinky because the narrow gauge track, and the engine was a steam steam engine, but it burned coal, and it cranked up and down the track. It was picturesque, and it got county approval to run their tracks on county roadways, so they didn't have to have a separate right-of-way. That's why it was cheaper. Southern Pacific came into Redlands on the Dinky track. Down in Bryn Mawr, there's a place they used to call Redlands Junction, and off the main track of the Southern Pacific bought from Bryn Mawr all the way into Redlands the right-of-way in 1892. And so they arrived by putting a 3rd rail next to the Dinky narrow gauge track and made the loop. They wanted to run Southern Pacific trains on the whole part of the Dinky, but the curves down on Tippecanoe and on California Street and Mission Road were too tight, and trains can't make tight turns. And so the tightest turn that they could make was the one at California Street and West Citrus. And as I said, that right away you can still see it. So Southern Pacific arrived then in 1892. Now, Southern Pacific and Santa Fe are running 5 trains daily. During the tourist season, Santa Fe has called a kite-shaped track train, and they ran from Los Angeles all the way to San Bernardino. Everybody a little rest there, and then took the upper loop, went to Redlands, Mentone, Highland, then back to San Bernardino. And on the kite-shaped track, figure 8 shape, you could, only place you'd see twice on the whole trip would be San Bernardino Station, but you got to see the whole eastern San Bernardino Valley area on that track. It became very, very popular. Southern Pacific and Santa Fe, the 2 tracks down Redlands, one is on Park Avenue, one is on Redlands Street, and in between, packing houses were built. And whoever offered the lowest freight rates, the packing house either would ship the oranges out the front door or the back door, depending upon which of the railroads offered the better freight rates in terms of shipping. So it was a positive for Redlands, but put Redlands on the map. Until 1888 came along, Orange Street, called the Link as far as a subdivision, was pretty dead. After 1888, where Romano's is located, and it has a twin building just 3 doors down, the Finney Block, 2 Finney Blocks were built, all in 1888 around both the east and west side of Orange Street just instantly popped up as a boom town. And then Redlands and Laguna became really linked because Orange Street connected the two areas. The Southern Pacific track, they sold out their right-of-way, and so in like 1988, part of the right-of-way, there's the Centennial Plaza built right over the top of it, and we used parking for on what used to be Southern Pacific right-of-way for the Citron restaurant and for the Finney Block for Joe Greensleeves. That's part of the right-of-way for Southern Pacific. And so Southern Pacific gave up that right-of-way, and since all the track's been torn out and probably melted down. Welcome to Sylvan Park, Laguna Heights Dump. And as I say, Laguna Heights Dump, some of the rolling hills out here are actual rolling hills, but some of those rolling hills, about a foot beneath them, are the trash from Laguna from the 1870s to the mid-1880s. Laguna people were dumping their trash here because, well, this was part of the Somers Tract. Nothing seemed to be going on here. Water in the Mill Creek Zaha is too low to bring up to this area for irrigation. And most of all the water that was coming down the Sunnyside Ditch was being used down the Stillman Ranch on his 3 80-acre vineyards. And so this area here was kind of no man's land. And so when we finally did get a community at Laguna Heights, that's High Street and Division and Chapel Street, when we finally did get a subdivision in here, people of Laguna just brought over their trash and dumped it here. There was a movement, though, in 1888 that realized that the Mill Creek Zaha was really a treasure. Here you have Southern California, dry Southern California, essentially a desert, and you have this mountain stream with alders and oak trees and sycamores, and you have this bubbling brook, which is essentially irrigation water, but it's a mountain creek, has abundance of trout and everything. So you have all this, and you've kind of despoiled it. And so there was a movement afoot to change this area. So the first thing that occurred here, this little pathway you see here, that is Sylvan Boulevard. When Redlands incorporated in 1888, we only had one boulevard. That's it. The only declared, we have avenues and streets, but for the most part, connecting Old San Bernardino and Crafton with Redlands, Sylvan Boulevard was established. So Isaac Newton Hogue, whose house is in 1888 built here in Laguna Heights, was the forerunner to say we need to save this area. And then, of course, George Cook, one of those, you might say, predominant people who helped get Redlands incorporated, had the grocery store, the post office, the meat market, all the things that are important. He said, I'm going to establish a tract over here, and eventually I'd like to see this tract of land become a park. And he called it Laguna Park as a tract map. That is the area south of the University of Redlands, which includes Cook Street, Sylvan Boulevard, and Central, and several Grove Street, all through there. That's Laguna Park. And he was so disappointed in 1901 when he wanted to turn this over to the City of Redlands, and the city said, we already have Canyon Crest Park open to the public for free. We don't really need, and we had Prospect Park, which opened to the public for practically free. We don't need another park. And so Laguna Park was subdivided. So in 1911, as we've discovered, okay, the Smileys have moved out of town, they've been gone. Sylvan, we need another park for the Laguna side of town. And so there was a movement abreast to save this area, and so the city purchased the land here, and in 1912 Sylvan Park is designated, and of course, to maintain the boulevard, which is now a walking path, and to realize our history is connected to the Mill Creek Zaha, which I said earlier was significant. And 1912, this was still running irrigation ditch going right through the center of Redlands. But by then, the University of Redlands had started here on Stillman's Ranch. We changed the street name over here. University Street was really called East Street because it was the east part of the Redlands and Laguna settlement, okay? East Street, okay? And I thought, comically, one of the histories on the streets and avenues of Redlands talks about Dr. Lawrence Nelson suggested that university lost a perfect opportunity in 1907 when they started the University of Redlands. All they had to do is change one letter on East Street, take the T away, put in a Y, and they could have been on Easy Street from beginning to end. So, but anyway, that is the eastern boundary of Sylvan Park. It's an L shape because the trash dumps, the main dump here was on the upper section here, and then it skirts along the Sankey, and they wanted to have as much of the Mill Creek Zaha as part of the park. And then, of course, after the city got it done, Redlands High School senior class thought as a senior project, each of the seniors would plant one tree in Sylvan Park. And so the trees at the west end of the park on Division Street were planted in 1912. Then 1913, 1914, 1915 are most of the other trees that are throughout the park. Our graduating classes back then were in the 20s in terms of numbers, so you didn't get a lot of bang for your graduation buck. But I would say a good majority of those trees are still alive and well and living in Sylvan Park to this day. Over the years, clubs in Redlands, whether it's Optimus or Rotary or others, donated money for the cobblestone bridges that you see throughout the park, and of course the benches, the picnic tables, everything like that. Then in 1922, the park was so popular, and of course the Mill Creek Zaha was still flowing, the idea of having a community plunge was established. And so right over here to my right, Sylvan Plunge was dug out by volunteers. The city took over the running of it, and once a week they fill the plunge with water right out of Mill Creek, good fresh water, ran it through a little siphon filter, and then after they filled the water, left it in a week, rather than use chlorine and other chemicals, they drained the water out back into the irrigation ditch and then put in fresh water for the next week. And so that rotation kept going all the way to the 1960s. I don't think they were using water out of Mill Creek after 1924 because it wasn't flowing as much then as it had earlier, but up until then it was the way they filled and emptied the plunge. I would say there's real fascination with Victorian homes in Redlands today. They didn't exist even 20 years ago. When I first got married, my wife was from San Bernardino. We lived on Brookside Avenue, an apartment house on Kendall. And I had grown up in Crafton, and old houses in Redlands, who cares about old houses in Redlands? I mean, I didn't have much of a thought about them, but my wife Nancy, on our bicycle, we'd bicycle around on Brookside and up and down Center Street and Cypress and Olive, and we had our daughter strapped in a little baby seat on one of the bikes, and so we tootled around. And I realized as I was reading the Citrograph newspaper and indexing it, it had all the short little snippets on the building of these houses. And so I collected all that material, not interested in myself particularly. And as we got in the mid-70s, Paul Allen, teacher at Valley College that I had, and Larry Burgess, drummed up the idea that we ought to have a class on Victorian homes in Redlands. And so I had gone to the library. I had my 35mm camera. I had a slide stand, and I produced all kinds of reproductive slides on the Victorian homes of Redlands. And then I began putting them in order, all those built in 1882, 1883, then by street, and then by, high Victorian versus the later Victorian kinds of periods and things. And so, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. I showed the slides, I just had one tray of 80 slides on Victorian homes, and the crowd that we had for that class was just overjoyed. They just loved it so much. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know much about those homes, except when they were built, what they cost. I didn't know anything about the architecture particularly. But in the next week, before I presented the next slideshow, I took all 80 more pictures, put together a whole new slideshow. Now I have about 5,000 slides of homes in Redlands, and not only by street, but the time in which they're built, all that kind of stuff. But needless to say, I found out the fascination grew. In 1976, with the bicentennial, one of the art teachers at University of Redlands repainted his house on Olive Avenue. It's one of those houses you drive by all the time and nobody noticed. Well, Dr. Brownfield painted it with the traditional colors, the New England hues that you would have expected at the turn of the century. Everybody did double takes. Frank Moore of the Redlands Daily Facts wrote column after column in his grain of salt about Victorian homes. And I think Redlands fell in love with the homes that it had built in the 1880s, 1890s. And now, still in teaching the class on Redlands history, more people seem to be fascinated with the homes than any other aspect of our history. It's a tangible part of place that makes Redlands different. That we're lucky that we were off the beaten track for years, and at the end of the railroad track, you might say, so we didn't get the normal traffic of San Bernardino or Claremont or Etiwanda and other areas. The result where they've torn down many of their Victorian homes, we have still quite a few, but compared to what we used to have, oh my gosh, fire has devastated our Victorian homes because they were, many of them built before electricity, then they added knob and tube, and the electrical conduit didn't have the right kind of insulation. Redlands rats have gnawed on them, and so we've lost a lot of Victorian homes over the years because, well, just ordinary things happen. And then burning a candle at night, anything that will start a fire. And so we've lost more homes due to fire than to construction and new home subdivisions. We've lost a few since the 1970s, but now the spirit from the Redlands Conservancy, the Redlands Area Historical Society, and I think Redlanders in general is to try to save our constructed, built past, because it makes Redlands feel unique. And truly it is unique.